everybody. My name is Eddie Young, Chris Obote, and this is Educate Your Vote. And I have the pleasure of interviewing Ray Shackelford, who is the current president of the National Urban League Young Professionals. He's a community advocate. And I'm just excited to dive right into it. So, Ray, do you have anything that you want to say before we start?
No, just thank you for having me to come on. I think it's critical for us to have these types of conversations to continue to elevate and discuss politics and civics and make sure that people are engaged in a meaningful way. So, like you said, let's get into it.
All right. So, I'm going to kick off with the first question. Why is it important to vote in all elections?
Yes. So, it's very critical to vote in every election for the simple fact that in order for us to really create the type of change that we want to see, we have to be consistently engaged and not just voting in every election, but voting the entire ballot. So obviously, we just got done with the presidential election, historic numbers across the board in terms of early voting, total vote numbers, etc. Even historic amounts of money, I think, were spent as it relates to this election. We won't get into campaign finance, I don't think, today, but that's a whole different topic. But one of the things that people should be paying attention to as a result of those results that we received thus far is the different systems that work in concert with the president to get things done. So you have the two parts of the Congress, you got the Senate and the House. And as a result, we have two seats that will be going to runoffs in Georgia. And it's important to watch that because depending on which way they go, it will either create a split in the Senate, where there's pretty much a 50-50 break between the Democratic and Republican caucus, where now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris will be the tiebreaker, or the Republican caucus will maintain the majority, and they will have at least a good portion of say in terms of what things get pushed. And so, for example, we had a record confirmation of Supreme Court justice, I think it was like 30 days. And there have been two bills, particularly, that the National Urban League has supported that have been sitting for months. You have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and you have the much needed, most recent round of stimulus that has not come back to our community. So that's just an example where they opted to focus on what they wanted to focus on, which was Supreme Court justice versus the needs of the people. And so I think what we've done in years past is everybody comes out to vote for the president, and you feel like I did my job, and then you walk away. And that's not how it works, because we have elections coming up in 2022, 2024, et cetera, where you have other Senate seats, you have other congressional seats, you have governors. And that's important because there have even been instances, especially because we're in Texas, where a president, most recently President Obama, he may have created some type of law and we're supposed to get some type of funding. But there have been instances where the governor, I think at the time Governor Perry, said, well, we don't want to take that because he doesn't agree with Obama. And so then that hurts us because he doesn't accept whatever that funding is. And so, you know, without making it too complicated, I think it's just important to understand that all of these different positions impact us, and the way you see and feel it is different. And so that's why the education piece is so critical, especially when you talk about local elections. And I guess it's the last thing I'll say. We can, you know, move forward with the conversation because I know I'm talking a lot.
No, you're good. You're good.
But my brother, who just finished up as the appointed Harris County clerk, that was a very good example of what an elected official can do and how you see and feel that. Because in Harris County, we had historic options available in terms of voting centers, being able to go vote any and everywhere you wanted to, the technology when you're talking about the ability to track your mail ballot, drive-through voting for the first time in history, 24-hour voting cycle for the first time in history. So there was literally no excuse. I mean, community orgs, we were working with them to make sure people had transportation to the polls, Metro, Lyft, Uber, all these different things. And so that's a very good example of who you vote for, or in that instance, who got appointed. But that's still an elected official that impacts you, and you see and feel that. Versus before, there was a time where you couldn't go wherever you wanted to on election day. You had a very specific place that you had to go to.
I remember those days.
Right. And it's like some of these things you just kind of ask yourself, why haven't we always had it?
Exactly.
And, even I remember the Governor Abbott, he did something where he made it to where there was one drop-off box in every county in Texas. And Harris County is the third largest county in the United States of America. And you're giving us one drop-off box for mail-in ballots. And so, again, these are, examples that you can see and feel. And so I'm kind of thankful for us being able to shine a brighter light on those things so people can kind of understand. But that's a very long answer in terms of why you need to vote in every election. And there's much more that goes into it. And that's why we'll be doing more education in the months to come.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that answer, right? Just because it's important, just like Ray said, it's important not just to vote in every election, but vote like on every position too, right? And that's why we have Educate Your Vote, right? Because we want to educate people on some of these positions that are not so sexy, right? Like, I had Tanisha, who kudos to her, she won her race as the new Harris County clerk and county clerk. And so, those positions, people don't know what those mean from that to, mud districts to independent school districts to all these different things. And so, like you said, these rightfully impact us, especially on the local level. The presidential federal level, yes, they're going to impact you, but you don't necessarily feel them directly until it hits like your backyard and you're like, why are taxes this way? Why is my child's school doing this? Why is my job being impacted? You have all these different questions that directly come from your vote. So that's why we're here to educate people on their vote. So 2020 elections, I will say this, that this 2020 has been a year of the impossibilities becoming like realities. And so I say that because, like you rightfully said, Chris Collins, kudos to him, where Harris County was able to do unconventional things for the first time to allow people to vote and give them that access in such a way where we have never done that before. And it's like, why didn't we do that? And now we see that there's possibilities, and there's definitely have been some pushbacks. A lot of it has been in the court systems about, are mail-in ballots going to be validated, drive-through ballots, are they going to be validated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So with these 2020 elections, what does that necessarily mean for Americans now? So like moving forward, we, like you said, there's a runoff in Georgia, and you kind of mentioned that, but moving forward, I know that Biden Harris have their own platform, and a lot of some of these elected positions and officials who have won their so-called race yet, they have their platform. But how does that trickle down to like us as Americans? Like, I voted, I did my civic duty. So what does that mean now that this person is not in office? Like, I want us to be able to engage the voters still, even after they've finished voting. They know who the people are now. What's the next step? Like, how do we continue to keep that engagement going?
So I think, and I'll try to kind of cascade it down from the federal level, and I alluded to it, as you mentioned, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, they will be inaugurated. I think it's what, the 20th? I believe
It's something in January.
it's like a Wednesday, but I think it's the 20th. And I know one of the first things he intends to do is to sign us back into the Paris Climate Accord. I know that's one thing he mentioned. Now, there's going to be, unfortunately, we're kind of trying to wait and see what happens with these Senate seats, because there are large pieces of legislation that I know he would like to get pushed through when you're talking about healthcare and climate control. And even when you look at some of the stimulus relief that we may need going, into 2021, just because the pandemic has literally ravaged the country from an economic standpoint, where you're talking about job loss, businesses that are closed and won't open again. And
Right.
so from a federal perspective, that's kind of the challenge right now. It's very much wait and see. I mean, there are some things that he can get done via an executive order. We saw President Obama do a lot of that his last term, but that's not the ideal way to get done. You know, it's intended for us to be able to work across the aisle, so to speak, in a bipartisan fashion. But you know, we're gonna look at what those relationships look like. I think one of the positive things is that President-elect Biden has worked in the Senate before, and so he has relationships. I think that that is something that will benefit him in terms of trying to negotiate some things on behalf of the American people. And the other thing is the Supreme Court, which they haven't really talked a lot about, because the biggest piece of at least Senator Mitch McConnell's legacy is what he's done to the judiciary in the amount of federal judge appointments, as well as these last 3 Supreme Court justices.
Right.
So we've heard the term a lot, unpacking the court, because they've packed a lot of conservatives, and it has the potential to shift landmark pieces of legislation, you know, like
Right.
Brown versus Board of Education, the Voting Rights Act. You know, we're talking about abortions and pro-life. Like, there are some major things that potentially could be undone or shifted as a result of this. So those are things that we're trying to, you know, monitor and bear watching. But as you look closer to the local level, the next piece is people being engaged. And I honestly really have seen a lot of this even since George Floyd, is paying more attention to city hall meetings, paying more attention to commissioners court. So you brought up our friend Tanisha. You know, congratulations to her. She is now the Harris County clerk. One of the things that shifted that I don't think a lot of people paid attention to is that we now have what's called an elections administrator.
Right.
And so the powers were taken to run elections from the Harris County clerk's office and to register people to vote from the Harris County tax assessor and put into this one role. And so now the Harris County clerk still has a lot of important operations from a clerical standpoint, administrative standpoint for us. They still have to manage. But these are the types of decisions that get made at a commissioner's court or at a city council meeting. There was even just something Councilman Pollard posted this past week on his social media about another relief that was issued through the city or through Harris County. And so because we can't always—
I'm gonna pause you real quick. It was through Harris County.
Okay, it was Harris County.
They just released that, but that deadline was like from the 2nd to like the 6th. Don't know if we knew about it. And it was the people who are, or the entities, I posted it on my social media as well. The entity that is responsible for distributing those funds was Catholic Charities. So you have like these little pockets between the city and the county of funding being available, but like the turnaround time to get the information out is very, very like quick, very short. And so a lot of people end up not knowing about it and miss those opportunities. But anyways, get back to what you're saying.
Well, no, and thank you for adding that additional context, because that's the types of things that people need to be paying attention to and engaging in. I even had a chance to stop by one of my friends over here. She owns Cromville, Ella. If you haven't, go check her out.
Hey, that cookies, vegan cookies. Listen, they're really good. Okay.
Yeah, it's all of that. So y'all go show us some love, you know, support Black business, support Black women. But one of the things she said to me was that she wants to see who her elected officials are and start to better educate herself about who they are, what they do, and making sure she's engaging. And so we have a legislative session coming up this spring. We have redistricting on the horizon. We just finished the census. And because we still have a Republican-controlled legislature in the state of Texas, we have to see how they want to run this session. Do they want it to be in person? Do they want it to be online? Do they want it to be hybrid? And that is something that we as a collective community, whether you Black, African, immigrant community, Latinx, whatever, this is going to impact you in a very significant fashion. And so we have to pay attention to the bills that are being introduced, what's actually coming to the floor, those votes, and all these things are open to the public. You just have to, well, hopefully you have access to internet, and if you don't, it gets kind of complicated with the coronavirus because normally you'd be able to go to the library, but you may or may not be able to access those things just based on what's going on in the county and the city. But said all that to say, these are the things that we have to pay attention to because there's a lot of relief our communities need, and it's going to come from that session, and redistricting is how they're going to draw the lines for the people that represent us moving forward for the next 10 years. So we have to be very vigilant.
So, right, I like that you touched on redistricting, right? And that, and just you correct me if I'm wrong or not, because it still goes with educate your vote. So redistricting, that comes from the census, and like how does that play into who represents who, right? Because I'm assuming, and this, it's my ignorance, and anybody else who feels say it's a safe space, but in regards to redistricting, right, we're talking about redistricting in terms of your council district, redistricting in terms of your county precinct, redistricting in terms of like who represents you, how much of that big piece of a pie, I guess, that county or that precinct or that council district gets in regards to representation. And then from the census, right, that information that's collected, they say, hey, we're going to give X amount of resources to district whatever, because we've seen that based on the census, this is what the population is, blah, 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 blah. Like explain to us, like how does that redistricting work and how is the census tied into that?
Right. So the census, the decennial census is done every 10 years. We just finished it. There's a lot of controversy just because they kept moving the deadline and there were lawsuits and whatnot. Urban League was a part of that. It has now been completed, and what's taking place, what takes place immediately after that is what's called the reapportionment process. And essentially, we have 435 members of Congress, in the House. And they are reallocated based on population counts. Now, before we had the census, they were projecting that Texas was going to pick up some additional congressional seats just because of the population counts. A lot of the top growing cities, whether it be Austin, Houston, Dallas, across the country, they're all here in Texas. And so
I have a quick question. So in that, does that deal with like the electoral number of electoral votes that you have as well? Or is that something totally different?
So population does also have something to do with electoral college votes. That's why California, Texas, Florida, even Pennsylvania, because of the amount of people we have in our states, that's partially how we get those electoral college votes based on population counts. The congressional districts is specifically tied to the reapportionment process and the redistricting. So right now, for example, for me, my congressional representative in the 18th district is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. They will be able to redraw what her district looks like. And if they add additional seats, let's say in Houston and Harris County, they can draw those based on what's best for their party. So instead of that, potentially, if they were to draw it just normal, it may end up being more democratic. But if they draw it the way they want to, and that's where you get into what's called gerrymandering, they can make sure that they pick up an additional seat. So now when it's time to go to the House and vote, they have more Republican members of Congress than the Democrats. And so that's why it's something you have to watch, because even if you look at some of the maps and how districts are drawn now, it can look real weird. Like it doesn't really make any sense. There's no rhyme or reason, but that's because they drew it along party lines or sometimes along ethnic lines. They may want it to be, all the Black people or lumped together in this district versus we may have enough political power to actually get 3, but they just want to keep us in this box. And so that limits our power. And
Mm.
so that's really what it comes down to. The piece you mentioned about the money, that's based on who we vote for, because they will get money via the census that they are then responsible for working with their counterparts in government to push that back to the community. It's different layers because a lot of it is federally funded programs. And that's probably a whole other session we'll have to just do just to talk about that specifically. But it is very important.
Okay, so y'all heard that. We're gonna bring Ray back to talk about a couple of things a little bit more specifically so that we can be a little bit more educated on this process. So I won't lie to you, right? For me, I feel like I'm an average American. This entire like election process, just the civic engagement process, just seems so overwhelming because, like you said, there's so many layers. And yes, like a lot of this information is privy to you via internet. It's open to the public, and that's great. But it's almost as if it's like if you don't know where to look, you're just kind of still like, I don't know where to first like look. And you can easily say, oh well, Google who your such and such is, or look on your voter registration card. But to be very honest with you and frank, like I got the registration card, I threw it on my fridge. Did I take it with me to go and vote? No, I did not. Did I look at some of these numbers? No, I didn't. And I feel like there's some people that are like me, that they don't look at that voter registration card, and it has like literally everything on there, like from your mud district to your precinct number to everything. It has those details on there, but it's not like I'm like, oh, let me go back and check my voter registration card, because you don't necessarily need it to vote. You can just take your ID. So I just say that because for me, being more politically engaged, more civically engaged, just being more curious, trying to find out what's going on. For the average person, they're not really like, I would say like as aware of some of the things that we may know, just because we are more into the community things and know what's going on, etc. So I guess what would be one piece of advice for like a person who maybe this is their first time really paying attention to the elections, not necessarily voting in the elections, but because of the way these elections went, and you're seeing like media showing people counting votes, right? You're seeing like just how everything is playing out in the media. What would be one piece of advice that you would give somebody who is like, you know what, I really want to be more like civically engaged, but I don't really know where to start? What would be a piece of advice that you would give that person?
Well, first, I would say start local and start small. So you would look at, for example, who's your city council person? I know I live in District D, and so my city council person is Carolyn Evans Shabazz. Her chief of staff, I know her daughter. And so I know my elected official that is responsible for my city council district, but I also know my representative for the Texas House, Rep. Sean Theory. I know my senator for Texas is Boris Miles. And so from that perspective, I think that's a good starting point. It's not too much information to take in, and it's also, it gives you a piece of the city as well as the state government. Because from the city side, your city council person is the person who basically advocates for you and your community on a consistent basis. And understand that based on us having a very strong mayoral structure here in the city of Houston, it's very critical for them to have a good relationship with Mayor Turner, because he ultimately sets the agenda. And that's how our city government works. So literally, you can get mad at your council person all you want. There might be this one topic you just want them to put on the agenda. They can only get it on the agenda with Mayor Turner's approval. And so there may be instances where, for whatever reason, he may not want to put that on the agenda, and they're gonna have to find another way to get that facilitated. Now they have budgets that they each get allocated that they can use to an extent, but just understanding that dynamic, I think, listening to different podcasts, there's so much information out there. Like what you're doing is very much needed to educate people. I have a Morehouse brother, Sean King, who's like a national activist. He does a lot of different podcasts on different topics. Just start small. Don't try to, because it is a lot. Even for me, who's someone who is engaged, I just have to take a break. Like today, outside of this conversation we're having, I'm not talking about politics. And it gets hard because everybody wants to ask me, hey, Ray, what do you think about? I'm like, listen, not today. We can
Right.
talk about that Monday. Give me 24 hours. And then you got the state piece that's important because we have a legislative session coming up. So for those that don't know, every other year, our state officials come together to look at our state budget, make decisions like coronavirus relief, what they're going to do from a state standpoint. And so we have to pay attention to that. So I need to know, what is Rep Theory going to be proposing? Like, what is she working on? What is Senator Miles, bringing to the table for our community? And understanding, who works for them, where their offices. And so I think just that piece is a good starting point. But I think, this is the last thing I'll say on it, is just sitting in a city council meeting, just listening to some of the things that they discuss, because sometimes it's very interesting, other times it's boring, but it's government. That's how it works. And
Right.
so you have access to it in a way that we haven't before because of the pandemic. You can log into the Zoom and watch it or just listen to it while you're working if you have that option to work from home. And so I think just engaging that way are things that you can do to kind of lay that foundation and get started.
Okay. So, and then also, can you touch on like how county government is also a part of that engagement as well?
Yes. So Commissioner's Court makes some very critical decisions, and that is comprised of the 4 commissioners as well as the county judge. And so they run Harris County. And one of the clarifications I think it's important to make is people get confused about the county judge is basically the CEO of Harris County. I think is a better way to describe it, because people get confused with that title, like it's a courtroom, and it's not necessarily what you think of when you say like a court or a judge. So making that distinction, but they have done some very critical things for the community between relief for small businesses. I know Commissioner Garcia worked with, I think he was the one who spearheaded it, but he worked with Commissioner Ellis to do some relief for small businesses. They've worked together to help, come up with the voting centers. They worked with the Harris County clerk because that wasn't something that was always there. And so Commissioner's Court is another one where it's important for you to sit in, to speak out if there's an issue that you want to testify for or against. And that's part of how you make sure that your voice is being heard. And, it'll also allow you to build relationships with those elected officials. So, they are our public servants. I think people forget that because I can't remember who mentioned it. It might have actually been Councilwoman Thomas. She referenced the fact that some people look at elected officials as celebrities.
Celebrities, yeah.
Right. And they're not. They're people just like me and you, and they get paid via our tax dollars. So they are, beholden to you, whether you voted for them or not. And so you have to engage in that way. It doesn't mean you go up to them yelling and being disrespectful, but you need to make sure that you know who they are, you know their staff, and that you're communicating them about what you want to see for you and your community. So establish a relationship, establish a rapport, do so in a respectful way, and make sure that what you need is getting at least heard. And ultimately, if you're not seeing the changes you want, you either vote them out, or you run against them. You have other options. So I keep saying it, that's a conversation for another day. It's so many different things.
It's so many different things that we're going to have a part 2 with Ray. So, or 3 or 4, because he has so much knowledge, you guys. Like, he's putting us on game. So with that, right, and I'm still kind of on these elections a little bit, but um, we heard the projected, President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And I kind of want you to touch a little bit about like which voting base, if you know the answer, or if you don't know, if you're assuming, but which voting base do you feel like was the strongest that was able to dictate how the elections came out, or the projected winners came out? Like, is it more white suburban women? Is it black people? Is it millennials? Is it seniors? Is it what do you think was the tipping point that said, okay, this group of people, they really were the ones that like pushed it forward?
So based on, I haven't dug all the way into the numbers, but based on the numbers I have seen over the last few days, it is primarily been urban centers and Black people that have decided the outcome of the election. Black women, leading that way. And I want to say in Pennsylvania, it was Philly as well as Pittsburgh. Then you had obviously Atlanta, DeKalb County, DeKalb County, Cobb County, Fulton County, these different areas that are large urban centers that ultimately were able to carry President Biden and a lot of the Democratic ticket. And I think one of the important pieces of this, you even look at somebody like a Stacey Abrams who ran for governor, and with the New Georgia project, the work that they were able to do down there to register all those voters and help not only to expand the electorate, but actually turn them out to vote
Right.
in record ways. Because I think this is the first time, I can't remember exactly how long, but Georgia hadn't been blue for a while, is my understanding.
Oh yeah, it's
Um,
been a minute. This has been a minute.
and so, and I said all that to say that irrespective of what your party affiliation is,
Right,
because I
right.
do need to make that disclaimer, Urban League is nonpartisan.
And
Um,
this show is also nonpartisan. Just want to let you all know.
um, but the large urban centers and Black people definitely showed up and showed out in this election cycle. And so a lot of the talk that we heard previously about holding your vote hostage and wanting something for your vote, which I don't think they're the same thing. I'm not a fan of telling people to hold their vote hostage just because the system's going to move forward with or without you. However, you should always want and demand something for your vote, and you still have to vote in every election just because you don't always get what you want. It's not, you shouldn't take a mindset of, oh, my candidate didn't win, I'm going to take my ball and now I don't want to play anymore. Like, that's not productive. And so you have to continue to engage, you have to continue to push forward. And I think for me, what I'm hoping to see is that both of these parties engage Black people in a more meaningful way because they see how critical we are to shaping the electorate and determining the outcomes of elections in this country when we are motivated. And so we have to continue to motivate one another, continue to expand the electorate, work on pieces of legislation that will restore the voting rights of individuals who have gone through the criminal justice system. When you're talking about ex-felons, because once you paid your debt to society, you should
Mhm.
be able to vote again. That is
Right.
a stance of the Urban League. That is a stance that I have personally. And so that is, I think, as good an assessment I can give you at this moment without digging further into the numbers. So
Right.
I hope that is sufficient.
I think so. I think the people will appreciate that answer. So, I would like to touch on this because you mentioned this, right? And I like to tell people that like every year is an election year. Like you need to make sure that you know what's going on. Whoever is about to their seat is up for reelection, make sure you know whatever amendments or whatever is being brought to the table to be on the ballot, know it. So I want to know, I know you are the president of the National Urban League of Professionals. How do you guys provide information to people like myself, right, who may not know like the in between years of when to vote or what's more important to, pay attention to, like you mentioned. Like a lot of people, the sexy years is always presidential years, and they're in their seats for 4 years. But then somewhere down the line, you have the mayor, you have commissioners, you have city council, you have these different amendments that's going to affect you. So, what are some ways that the Urban League is kind of like providing information or pushing like the narrative of saying, hey, like, okay, like you said, next year is like a legislative year where there's going to be a lot of different policies, and I heard that from Tanisha as well, that are going to be put forth, right? So how do we know what those things are, one, and then two, how do we provide like the education portion of like this is going to impact you this way, whether it's positive or negative, so that people are more motivated to go out and actually vote, or at least vocalize why they don't want this or why they do want this.
Okay, there's a lot in that question. So I'm gonna answer the piece I remember, and whatever I don't speak to, we'll circle back and close that up. So part of what we do and what we will be doing, and my team has already started to work on this. So my national advocacy chair, Chanel Brown, shout out to her, and my national committee and the civic chairs, civic engagement chairs all over the country, they've been killing it. They have a post-election education activation that we will begin here in the coming weeks as a part of Project Blueprint. And a lot of it is going to encompass, what we've discussed today in terms of why people need to continue to stay engaged. What does that look like? Upcoming legislative sessions. So even here in Texas in 2019, for the first time, the Urban League of Greater Texas, which was Austin, Dallas, and Houston, the three major cities where we have a presence, we went down to the state legislature to meet with elected officials to introduce ourselves and talk about the things that were important to our communities. And you and I have done this on the federal level several times with the Legislative Policy Conference as a part of the National Urban League. And it was something that we felt needed to take place here in Texas. And so now in 2021, we are going to not only engage in a more meaningful way, but pull in our community partners to do the same. So we're talking about fraternities, sororities, the faith-based community. We need to make sure that Black people show up in a major way to make sure our voice is heard, because that's how the wheels get turned when we need something for our community. If we're not there, if we're not advocating for ourselves, it's probably not going to get done. And so some of that will come via online activations. There will be some education campaigns we'll do. And depending on how the virus begins to shift, it may be, some canvassing efforts that we do. We do a good amount of that, whether it's actually engaging with people or leaving literature behind for them to read. I know people are irritated, especially this piece coming out of the election cycle, texting, phone calls. I get it. I know y'all get mad about it and probably want to use a different word, but it is one of the ways that we try to engage with people to get information in their hands. And so,
Right.
Between online, the limited amount of in-person, it'll be some hybrid activations, but definitely stay tuned when it comes to National Urban League, NULYP. Follow us on social media. The difficult part in the pandemic is how are we reaching the people who don't have online access. And so that's why, President Biden has spoken about broadband being in every home in the United States. And so hopefully that's something they can get done fairly early in their term, because it's needed now more than ever. We're talking about that digital divide that disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. So hopefully they can do that. But that's pretty much what it's going to look like from a very high level in terms of what that education. Now, in terms of the specific ballot measures that are coming up and how do you get educated on those, we usually find out probably within, and it just depends. Sometimes it's further out, maybe a year in advance, but it's usually a smaller window than that we have. But that's why it's important for people to pay attention to city council, commissioners court, the upcoming state legislature, so that you can know about the different measures, reading, you know, the Chronicle. You got the Texas Tribune, that's a nonprofit, nonpartisan piece of journalism that you can get access to. The Defender, 4 Times. Just pay attention, read. I try to tell people to pull information from a lot of different sources and then make a decision for yourself. Because if you lean too much into one publication, I think it's very easy to be one track with how you think and how you view things. And so just make sure that you do that as you're making informing these decisions.
Okay, thank you for that, Ray. So one of my second to last questions is I'm curious, right? How do we increase the voter, I guess, demographic in regards to millennials? I feel like the presence of millennials are there and they have the ability to do great things, right? And even now, like we're seeing that there's some millennials that were voted into Congress in this election cycle. And so I'm curious, you know, what your thoughts are on how do we increase that voter base and really kind of like create a balance in regards to age and generation when it comes to these elected positions, because oftentimes people are just not interested because they don't see themselves up there. They see like their parents or their grandparents or whatever in these elected positions. And so I'm just curious, like, what's your thoughts on how we can continue to encourage as well as increase the millennial voter base?
Well, you definitely touched on part of it. And I think it's something that resonates not just with millennials, but the electorate in general, is seeing yourself up there. So when you look here in Harris County, we have Tanisha. Tanisha, I don't want to tell her age. She's not 40. I may get in trouble. But Tanisha, Harris County clerk, she is a millennial. Don't hurt me, Tanisha. You have Councilwoman Tiffany Thomas. She's now 40. You have Councilman Edward Pollard. He's now 40. You have my frat brother, who's now the county attorney, and Christian Menifee. He is now 40. And so you have a lot more representation here in Houston and Harris County. And forgive me if I'm forgetting somebody, but those are just the ones that are like top of mind. And obviously Chris serving as the appointed Harris County clerk, being the same age as me. So that's part of it, because we are seeing more people that are millennials in elected office. I can already tell that more of us are engaged because of that. You have also millennials that are serving as chief of staff, you know, in District F and in District D. Those are the two that I think of off the top of my head. And so that plays a role, you know. Now, the other piece is that the issues and the things that are being presented need to resonate more with us. So when you're talking about from a federal perspective, since you brought up Congress previously, and I think it's somebody like an AOC, you have student loan debt relief.
Right.
That's a huge issue. Like I saw some people, they were happy about Joe, and then they were tagging him like, okay, Joe, what are we gonna do about these student loans?
Right.
By President-elect Biden, excuse me. And so that's something that is very critical when you talk about millennials, when you talk about affordable housing. I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine about the prospect of rent control, which it's not an easy conversation, because on the one hand, you have millennials who are trying to rent. And on the other hand, I have friends who are millennials who own these properties and use that as income. So what is that balance?
Right.
And so that's a very touchy topic. But those are some of the things that are important to us. But, you know, as millennials, we care about a lot of things. You know, we care about the environment, maybe not as much as Generation Z. I think they're probably at the forefront of that conversation. So shout out to Generation Z. But, you know, we want good jobs. We want a lot of different industries here in the city of Houston, like the whole tech innovation system and that corridor, that ecosystem that the city is building out. We're very interested in what that looks like. How are we factored into it? But even boards and commissions, that is something that I encourage everybody that's tuning in to look into. I'm now serving on my second board. Previously served on the Independent Police Oversight Board, and thankfully they are revamping that in a major way. So stay tuned to that. And that was one thing I didn't mention is here in the city, pay attention to what is going to come out of those recommendations from the mayor's task force. Don't lose sight of that, because that's part of what we're also going to be talking about at the state legislative level.
Okay.
Is that piece. But, and I got sidetracked, but you have these things that are moving, and it's important for us to engage and pay attention, because if we don't, that's why they're not speaking our issue. So we want them to talk to us, but if we just don't vote, think about it from this standpoint. If you're a business owner and you know 70% of your customers are baby boomers, are you going to spend a lot of time in marketing to millennials and Generation Z? Probably not, because you know 70% is coming from this demographic.
Right.
So when they look at the people who voted, when we don't vote, and it's such a small percentage, and they have whatever resources, they're going to allocate it to the people they know are going to show up and vote. So we have the ability to actually determine elections as millennials and Generation Z combined, but we have to show up in order to make them speak to us and speak to the issues that are important to us.
I like that. Okay. So listen, for me, right, just based on what you're saying, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And I think that now that 2020 has been a year of exposure, right? Whether that's good or whether that's bad. And I look at that in terms of exposure, especially in politics, for those who have never really been civically engaged. Like this year, by force you were, right? Even if you didn't want to. Like you heard it on the news, your friends were talking about it. It's just been one of those topics that throughout the entire year, you've been hearing how politics has been driving a lot of policies, change, laws, whatever the case may be. And so I will say that this is a year where people should be civically engaged. They should, like you said, start with the very basic level. Know who your county commissioner is, know who your city council person is, state, federal, and just kind of work your way up. But also, like, Councilwoman Tiffany Thomas said, like, these people are not celebrities, right? These are people who represent you. And I think that if we have that kind of mindset, then it makes it easy for us to feel like we can access them, right? Because it's not that they're not accessible. It's just that you just never, for me at least, I just never thought to like, let me call my city council person or let me call my commissioner or anything like that. I didn't personally think like that. And I'm sure other people didn't have that same kind of like, oh, let me call. It's like, what for? I don't have an issue. But sometimes it's not about having an issue, right? Just like you said, you and I, we went to introduce ourselves on, Capitol Hill. And it's just the introduction, creating that relationship, I think, is what a lot of us need to do with our representatives, is to create that relationship. Because guess what? Somebody else has created a relationship, and that's why they have their ear when it comes to certain things that come to commissioner's court or comes to city council or goes to policy change. It's because they've created a relationship and they say, hey, this person is always making noise about whatever needs to be made noise about, that it resonates with them. Like you said, millennials, we have so many different things that we care about. So now is the time for us to really create relationships with our elected officials and really begin to vocalize those concerns that we have, whether it's trying to figure out that balance between renting and buying, if it's environmental issues, it's social issues, from food deserts to income and equality. So those are just some things that I think of, like, if you're out of sight, you're out of mind. If you're not present, if you don't show up, then they have no reason, like you said, to meet you right at your point of your needs, or even to like access you, or even ask you anything. So I really appreciate you, Ray, for coming on Educate Your Vote, dropping knowledge, so y'all tune in. We're going to come back with part 2, 3, and 4 on some issues with Ray that he has. He couldn't speak on them today, as you said. It's for all of these are tabled for another day, and we're definitely going to hold you to that. So where can we find you, Ray? How can we continue to keep in touch with all the great information that you've given us?
So yes, thank you again, Adidion, for having me on to Educate Your Vote. Definitely enjoyed it. Great conversation. The one thing I left off was boards and commissions piece. So look into that. You can serve on boards and commissions. You'd be surprised about the qualifications. So apply for those. But you can find me on all social media platforms: LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm not on TikTok. I do not participate in that. But you can find me, Ray Shackelford, on all of those platforms. I'm usually pretty good about responding. You can message me, and stay tuned to the National Urban League Young Professionals and what we're doing here with the Houston Area Urban League. And hopefully, if you want to engage, reach out and help us make a difference in the community.
All right. Again, my name is Eddie Dion E. Chris Obo, and this is Educate Your Vote, and I will see you on the next episode.